here today. I really do appreciate it. And I'd really like to say off the bat thanks again to Codemotion for having me to be here in Madrid. It's a wonderful experience. So before I get too far down the road, I'll take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Dave Lewis, and why am I standing up here? Because I did roughly 25 years of information security work, and I've done everything from being a firewall admin right through to being a CISO. And all along that line, I have learned all sorts of lessons. And then the funny thing is, I actually started as a rapid application developer for a financial institution in Canada. And the lessons that I learned then and since has really afforded me the ability to have interesting discussions, because along the way, I've made a lot of mistakes. And in those mistakes, I've learned that I can actually share those with folks and the lessons learned. But this is primarily more about zero trust, which actually harkens back to a lot of the mistakes I made. So, you know, spoiler alert, I'm a hacker, boo. I very much like to associate with that word, because for me that means an intellectual curiosity about all things. Unfortunately, as you can see here, not everybody likes us. Unfortunate, but, you know, we never said anything mean about them. So, as I mentioned, I am Canadian. It's really interesting how it's now gotten to the point where I feel it necessary to actually point this out wherever I go, because people keep mistaking me for my southern cousins. There was a time I had no problem with that, but recently, it's been interesting. To the point where I was actually in a hotel in India about 2 years ago, and this lady walked up to me in the hotel lobby and she said, "Oh, excuse me, are you an American?" I said, "Well, no, actually, I'm from Canada. Why?" She goes, "Good." And I was, okay, that's just freaky. And in light of the fact that I work for a company that does multi-factor authentication, I even went to the extent of getting a maple leaf tattooed on my arm after that incident, because of everything I've experienced in my life. That was actually the scariest. So, in order to actually understand a Canadian, you have to see them in their natural habitat. We tend to be dressed up as homicidal maniacs and going across a sheet of ice at a very high rate of speed. But we also do other things, like I now work for Duo Security. Now, this has been a very amazing experience, because I started with the company with about 700 people, and then 3 months later, all of a sudden, we were bought by Cisco. And my initial reaction was, what just happened? But this is actually a great opportunity, because there's so many amazing resources that are there and allowing us as part of Duo to be able to leverage those. And one of the really cool things that you as a developer can make use of is the Cisco DevNet project. So if you check out developer.cisco.com, there's a lot of great resources there you might want to check out. So it's been really interesting, because we had Cisco, and then my boss said, okay, we've got Cisco and we've got Duo, so put them together, we've got Disco. And she's very funny. That's my boss, Wendy Nather. So what do? We're a company that does unified access security. I mean, how many people here have heard the term zero trust before? Cool, that's actually a pretty good number. Now, we have taken that, flipped it on its head, and we approach it from a different term. We call it unified access security, because, you know, zero trust is very much coined by somebody else. And the idea here is to actually secure access to all of your applications, users, anywhere, anytime. You don't have to be behind the firewall. So, the idea here is to establish trust, and we're here to put the trust back in zero trust. Now, to be fair, this is not a vendor presentation, but I just wanted to hit those key salient points out of the gateway. You want to make sure that you're verifying everybody and everything on your network, and as well, you want to be sure that you understand that your networks are hostile. Everything on your network is not the way you expect it to be. The really funny thing is, it's like far too many times I'll see servers that are built, that are internet facing, that are hardened down to the point where they can barely work at all. But internally, you'll have systems that are completely wide open, you know, several thousand ports, all sorts of old applications, and then we get problems like this. It worked in dev. Why doesn't it work in production? Because it's a completely different environment. So having that uniformity across your network is a really good piece. And why am I saying this to developers? Because you can help push for that change, right? Every piece of the puzzle all works together. And this is a great opportunity for developers to actually push for that greater level of security. So zero trust has been around for a very, very long time. I had my own encounter with it back in 2003 when it was called network zone segmentation, but we'll get to that a little later. So the documented way that things have gone on, we had the Jericho Forum came out with their version of deperimeterization in 2007. In 2010, John Kindervog was an analyst at, I believe it was Forrester at the time, coined the term zero trust. Great thing here, because he put a label on something that we should have been doing for basically the last 25, 30 years. And that was a fantastic thing, because all of a sudden people went, okay, I need to do this. Even though they should have been doing it all along, this is what it came to be. So in 2014, Google came out with their own version of what they saw as zero trust, and they called it BeyondCorp. Really cool way of securing your network. And they have all that documented, and it's all freely available, so you can check it out on their site. And then in 2017, this book came out called Zero Trust Networks. I may be a little off on the date. I think it actually just came out this year, but I got my copy this year anyway. And it is actually an excellent book. I don't know the authors myself. I have no affiliation with them. But if you want to learn more about them in a much deeper conversation than we can have in the 40 minutes that we're here, this is a great book to pick up. So BeyondCorp, their own implementation, we went through various different types of steps, and it was their implementation. And they have their way of doing things, and other different companies have different versions of what zero trust means. And in a short way of doing it, this is the old way we used to do networks, where we'd put up the castle walls, the moat, and keep everybody out. And then zero trust is not really caring where you are so much as they know who you are, what the device is, and that you are supposed to be accessing it. So you are the user in question. Pardon me. So an easier way to look at it is this. Nice and simple, clean and neat. And it's very much a tiered process. So an easier way to look at it is this. Nice and simple, clean and neat. And it's very much a tiered process. So when you look at it, you want to go through the various different steps. And I mean, it is a little bit hard to see at the back, I'm imagining. But you want to confirm your user identities. You want to see the access visibility. Check out your device security all the way up to securing access for all applications. This is a very salient way of doing things. And write down, if you want to put a sub-level on this, you want to know what the assets are in your environment. So if you're working on 10 different systems in your dev environment, and then your production environment has 12 different assets, and 2 of those aren't being properly managed, you need to know these things, because they could be introducing problems into your ecosystem. And that's the problem with zero trust today, as I see it, and that's why we tend to call it unified access security at our company, because we want to put a whole wrapper around it, as opposed to just saying this is the way it is, end of discussion. We want to look at it as an ideal to aspire to, because far too often people say, okay, this is the way it is, but if you ask 100 people in a room what is love, you're going to get 100 different answers. Same sort of idea with zero trust. So the idea here is to look at it from how would we see it and make it as goals to aspire to. The problem being is that you will never get to 100% zero trust. There's no such thing as 100% in security flat out. But an easier way to do it, and the way I like to describe it to people, is everything is on fire. So as a security professional, this is how we feel all the time. And having been a developer in the beginning, having transitioned to this, I'm able to actually see both sides of the fence. And one of the things that I've learned along that way, a very valuable lesson, is castles simply don't scale. So the idea of having, it's okay, we have a firewall, has very limited utility, especially in this day and age with AWS, Google Cloud, Azure. There's no shortage of ways to actually expand out on that. And we have to dispel with antiquated notions something like, oh, it's okay, we have a firewall, everything inside it should be fine. This is a real problem, because when an attacker goes after your network, they're going to go after whatever they can get into first. They're not going to spend $1 million 0 day to get into your network when they can just simply access a service that just happens to be running in a deprecated version. And passwords. We all love to be environmentally friendly, but reusing passwords is really not a good idea. This is one of those things where if you're using the same password of FluffyBunny123 on your iTunes account, your banking account, and so on and so forth, and one of those services gets compromised, the attackers will then take those credentials and then reuse them against other sites to see what else they can gain access to. And that could be a real problem. And the password doesn't confirm who you are. It just means that you have the magic key to get in, but it doesn't always let you in, because you really should have that extra level of security to get in there. So one of the really interesting lessons of history, and this is full disclosure, I used to be an archaeology major back when the world was flat. So about 30 years ago, I was in university, and I can't believe I can say that out loud. This is one of the most valuable lessons that I learned as it pertains to security. This was the sack of Rome in 410 AD. This was when the Visigoths came, and rather than assaulting the walls of the city, they set up camp around the entire city and waited. They used their own security paradigm against them. And then eventually they ran out of food, they ran out of supplies, and they had no choice but to open the gates and surrender. And then the Visigoths just walked through the door and they took the city. And this is one of those things. We have to be able to adapt. We have to be able to move, because just because we've done something for X amount of time is a null and void discussion point. Now in Canada, we have a thing, we have bears. And one of those things that when you're out on a hike, you want to make sure that you're faster than the person behind you. And that's usually the running joke that we have in Canada. As long as you're faster than that person, you're going to be just fine. But these days, especially in computer security, we have a lot of bears that we have to be concerned with. Now, the problem that we have is that in security, we have folks like this, who I refer to as the flaming sword of justice. Now, back a long time ago, when I was working for a power company in Ontario, Canada, we had one guy in there whose response to every single security violation was to fire anyone and anybody they could get his hands on. The problem is he didn't have any authority to do this, so he would have the vein bulging out of his forehead yelling about something that had gone wrong, or in his assessment had gone wrong. And this was doing nothing to improve the business environment. This was not doing anything to help the application developers. It was just a giant source of frustration. So I refer to him as the flaming sword of justice. This is the old way that security practitioners used to operate. This is fading away, thankfully. And now it's more about a discussion, and the discussion that needs to be had with the developers, and developers need to have the discussion with the security folks as well, because it can get better. But until it gets better, we have to learn some valuable lessons. Be willing to ask the question when you think something is askew, or if you're not sure. No one ever got in trouble for being not sure and asking the question. Case in point, how many people here are familiar with S3 buckets on AWS? Just a show of hands. Cool. How many people, you don't have to put your hand up for this one, but how many of you realize that by default it is not publicly accessible? Think about that for a second. There are so many websites out there that are being compromised where they say, oh, we've been hacked, when it turns out, upon further discussion, they had actually left their S3 bucket open to the world. And for those of you who don't know, an S3 bucket is a data repository. You can put image files, you can put unstructured data, whatever you want into it. And they allowed that access to happen. And this is one of those things where I'm willing to bet the people that set them to publicly available simply didn't know. So security practitioners like myself, this is where we have to take the tip of the sword, put it against our chest and lean forward, because we didn't take the time to properly educate them. And also, this is a point where you can all say, well, we could have asked the question as well. And it's not about assigning blame so much as this is how we improve things going forward. Because bad things are going to happen. For example, Marriott, I feel bad for them. They got pwned yesterday rather badly. We don't know the full details of this, but this is an example of what can happen when things go catastrophically wrong. And here are some numbers that are really interesting. They were taken from the Verizon data breach report from last year. 81% of breaches were involving weak credentials. So if your password is password, you have a target painted on you at this point. And another 70%, this was taken from the IDC research report, that 70% of compromised devices. So if your device is an iPhone or an Android device and you don't have a password on it or some sort of authentication method to get into that device, and you leave it on a bus, leave it in a restaurant, this could be a real problem. Because it's bad enough that we have a porous perimeter around everything in our networks, everything in our topologies. These are things that we need to have open in order to get business done, in order to have our applications run, but we also have to understand that if they're not up to snuff, or they're not current, or they're not properly protected, then you're going to have a real discussion point, which is a discussion we have to have at a very early age. We need to say, rather than spending a 10,000 euro at the back end, we need to spend a couple of euro at the front end to have that education conversation. And my boss has a really interesting line where she says, the perimeter is everywhere an access decision is being made. I used to be very much of the opinion the perimeter was everywhere your data is, but I like her description far better. So the new parameter is very much this. Remote employees, personal devices, vendors and contractors, mobile devices, and cloud applications.
just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean we have to stop doing things in a proper, secure fashion. Because otherwise, we're going to repeat the things that happened in the past. So I run a website on the side called liquidmatrix.org, and I started tracking data breaches back in 2012, because apparently I needed a hobby. So I went through, and one of the data breaches from that year was LinkedIn came in at 6.5 million records. At that time, that was massive. Now, as we saw with the Marriott data breach yesterday, it was somewhere in the order to it of between 375 and 500 million user accounts. And that wasn't even the biggest one. This is one of those things where it's really gotten out of control. And I really know what I'm talking about because I've lived through my own data breach. If you can see the top line of that slide, you can figure out where I was working at the time. This was a website that was put out by one of our marketing teams, and its campaign was over, and we found it and we said, okay, you're running a deprecated version of WordPress. We need to take this offline now. And they said, no problem, we'll shut it down, no problem at all. And I went away. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting at my desk and the phone starts ringing. Bad things usually happen about 9 o'clock in the morning when I'm sitting down to have my coffee at work. This was one of them. It was the CBC, which is a Canadian national publication, and they wanted to talk to me about our data breach, and I said, hi, what? Followed quickly in succession by every other publication you could imagine. And this is one of those problems where this site ended up being compromised, and I couldn't get mad at the marketing people because what was the piece that I forgot? Exactly, I forgot, I didn't follow up with them, and I didn't make sure it was taken offline. So you very much trust but verify in that particular situation. Now, luckily, the 192 accounts that were on that particular system that were compromised were not existing anywhere else in our network. So from a damage perspective, it was limited. It was all about reputational damage at that point. And thankfully, that was our communication team to deal with that. So this is an example from, this is 2 years ago now. Come on in. It was about 2 years ago. This is a site called informationisbeautiful.net. I have no affiliation with them, but they are a fantastic site you should check out if you like data visualization. They went through and they did a visualization of all the data breaches they had up until that point. That was 2 years ago. That was a few days ago. This is why I like doing these slides, because it has that whoa factor, which I heard up here somewhere. This is the impact I need to have getting across to folks so that we can start having far better conversations about security in general. So let's switch gears and look at Spain. I went through and I looked at some of the publicly available information that is out there on certain repositories, one in particular called Showdown. If you're not familiar with it, check out showdown.io. It's a really interesting site because this is how many ports were listening in Spain at the time that they were indexed. Obviously, your mileage will vary from day to day, but at that point in time when the snapshot was done, that's how many were listening. In Madrid, that's how many ports were open and available. Now, neither of these numbers are a real problem in of themselves. The thing is, when an attacker looks at those number of ports, they'll say, oh, targets of opportunity. Because you can be guaranteed statistically some of them are not going to be in a secure state. And some of them weren't. 64 compromised databases, 168 open webcams, and a bunch of industrial control systems. That number is a little squiffy because one of the manufacturers that does make control systems also makes home routers, so that number is a little bit off, so I won't take that one at face value. But when you have this as just a simple example of people, I can understand protecting your back alley. I can understand maybe you want to take a look at your favorite chair in the living room. But you really want to have access to your warehouse available freely online? I didn't have to break into any of these systems. These were all indexed by Showdown. These were freely available online. No password required to get into them. This is a very simple example if we can extrapolate out as to what happens if we're not authenticating our devices and services and what have you. So the zero trust network value proposition is, you know what, let's change that. There we go. Unified access security value proposition is as follows. We want to devalue stolen credentials. The attackers are going to, sorry, that's funny. The attackers are going to constantly try to get these credentials because they can reuse them on other sites. There is a monetary value for your credentials online. Sorry, every once in a while I see the camera pop up. It's just cracking me up. And we want to remove the low-hanging fruit. We don't want to make it easier for the attackers. We want to make sure that we're removing their ability to move laterally through your network, through your implementation, whatever it happens to be, because we need to make it harder for the attackers. Back in 2003, as I was mentioning earlier, this was my first foray into the idea of zero trust. In this particular example, I came up with the idea of saying all the servers, all the laptops, all the desktops will be treated as what we call bastion hosts. So we treated them as if they were attached to the internet, and all the systems would be hardened properly. Good news is that I escaped that meeting with my life. All of the system operators that would have had been in charge of maintaining these were not happy about this idea. But flash forward today in 2018, this is the conversation that's happening all over the place. Because as I said before, we have this bad habit of infrastructure folks building out servers that are hardened to face the internet, but we don't do the same level of diligence on our internal networks. So if you're looking at doing anything along the lines of a zero trust implementation, we want to set those expectations. We want to make sure, we want to make sure that we are not setting ourselves up for failure. Zero trust is not something, unified access security is not something that we can just flip a switch and done. It is a tiered approach. We want to make sure that we're looking at network zone segmentation. We want to make sure we're knowing what users have access to the systems on our network. A little sidebar, one power company I worked for a long time ago, I was there for 48 hours. I was with the company for 48 or 72 hours. And they asked me to do an assessment of how many of our developers from India were accessing the network. And as I'm going through, I see, okay, there was 7 different connections that was something very odd about those on that one day. And I went through and I did the timing. And I actually took a map and I mapped out all the different cities that were coming. They were coming from Chennai, Mumbai, Goa, and several others. And I thought, this is very curious. There's something that was bugging me. And it's one of those forest for the trees moments where I didn't see they were using the exact same key fob to access the network. So what they were doing is all of these developers were calling in to another party and saying, give me the number. They would type in the number and they would VPN into our network. Now, there was nothing malicious about what they were doing because they were just trying to get their jobs done and they had not been properly provisioned credentials. And we as the customer had not spelled out for them why that was such a bad idea. So when you're looking at doing any sort of zero trust idea, you want to make sure that you're approaching it from celebrating your wins. Every time you have an incremental change, you want to be able to celebrate that when you want to drive that as a champion within your organization. Because each little victory is one step closer to a better security paradigm. You want to determine what your priorities are as you're going through and trying to look at zero trust because you can't do everything at once. So you want to look at these foundational elements. Asset inventories are one great idea. If you're dealing with APIs, great. There's another way you want to say, okay, what is the inventory of the APIs in our network that we need to be aware of? We want to look at our zero trust, unified access security. There we go. We want to look at our shopping list as to what we want to do. That asset inventory is a foundational element. Whether or not it is libraries within your application, whether it's physical assets on your network, this is something you need to go through and check. There's a great company called Snyk. I don't know how many people are here are familiar. Show of hands, how many people are familiar with Snyk? Cool. Snyk, SYNK.io. Please check them out. They do a great thing. They also have a free implementation where you can actually take the libraries that you're using in your application and it'll look for security vulnerabilities in them. This is a really, really good thing. Because as you're going through and doing these sort of things, you want to make sure that your applications are secure as well as your assets are secure. You want to look at who's actually gone on your network. One user that we had in another company that I worked for was amazing. We did an assessment of all the passwords that were on the network, and this one particular account had been enabled for about 10 years. It was a super user account, and it had access to basically anything on the network, bar none. This person had left the company 10 years prior. The account was still enabled. Insult to injury, this person had actually passed away several years before that, before this account was discovered. So it's one of those things where we had this account that if somebody had that password, they could have caused a great deal of harm on the network. Defined repeatable processes are something that nobody enjoys talking about, but this is where you're going to get a lot of win. This is a great success point because you want to make sure that you're not running around firefighting. You don't want to make sure you're not throwing it over the fence and saying, it worked in dev just fine. It's prod's problem now. Ops can take care of it. These are those things that you need to address. And if you can create a defined repeatable process, each time you do a new project, it'll be able to iterate properly in a better fashion. And network zone segmentation, this is one of my favorites. One other company that I worked at, shall remain nameless, it was a global company with about 25,000 employees, and there was no network zone segmentation anywhere. I could sit at my desk in Toronto, I could query systems in Kuala Lumpur, I could query systems in Germany, and there was no way to tell where I was coming from or what I was doing because they weren't checking the logs. These are the kind of things we want to look at if your application is properly logging and auditing everything that's happening. You want to also look at making sure that you are taking care that the authentication flows are properly secured and authenticated. You don't want people to be able to query your API directly and pull information from your database without you knowing it, without them being legitimate users. One security conference in the United States last year found this out very much the hard way when their mobile app gave way to all 40,000 attendees. All their personal information was dumped because their API was open, easily queried. Everything is connected. So this is just an example of a submarine map with having undersea links, but this is just one example of how everything is connected. All your applications, all your systems, everything is connected in different ways. Where's that code coming from? If you are using a third-party library, like back when OpenSSL had their problem with Heartbleed, nobody was assessing the code, but everybody was using the library. We had just taken it at face value that it was secure because somebody said so. And you want to look at your partners that you're dealing with. That's a real big one. In one other shop that I worked for, we had about 300 vendors that we were working with in various different capacities, and they all had direct connections back into our network. Now, the interesting thing here was I went through and I found that the third-party assessments that were done, only half of them were done, and of those, roughly about 30 plus were actually complete. So we didn't actually know who had access to what. Enter the penetration test that I had commissioned to come in and check the security of our network. Again, sitting at my desk, first thing in the morning, having my coffee. 9 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings. I pick it up, and they say, okay, we're ready to start the test. All right, fantastic. Click. Off they go. 14 minutes later, the phone rings. They had managed to gain access to our network and every asset on the network. They had all the switches, they had all the routers, they had the Active Directory structure, because one of these third parties was not properly secured. And they were able to actually gain access to one of their applications that was being used between us and the partner. These are those things that we have to look at and make sure that we're doing a proper assessment of how the security posture is of our network. So when we go look back at all the ports that were open, one of the things that I like to do is I like to pick one of those ports at random whenever I give a talk like this and go through and look at what is available. In this particular case, I picked on SSH. So SSH is a secure connection protocol where you can get into a system using an encrypted entry point, and this particular one had this many vulnerabilities. This is just one example of thousands of SSH daemons that were listening in Spain alone. Specifically, there were that many systems that were listening. So that's not to say all of them are vulnerable, but this is just an example of a subset of those will be vulnerable, and the attackers will be looking for this sort of thing. And when you have all these sort of vulnerabilities that are available to them, we want to make sure that we are doing a better job of securing our environment. This may not be a developer thing specifically, but we are part of the discussion point. We want to make sure that when we're building out our applications, when we're building out all these things, that we are encrypting all of the traffic. We want to make sure it's encrypted at rest and in flight. So when we're looking at these sort of things, we want to understand that there is a better way to do things. You want to just move beyond the static password, because while that has a monetary value to the attackers, we will need to devalue that as a currency of the day. We want to make sure that there's a better way to do this. And one way to do it is using multi-factor authentication. Another one that came out, this was in April of 2018, so just a few months back, WebAuthn. How many people here are familiar with WebAuthn? By show of hands. Okay, good, I had a couple. So if you take nothing else from this talk, please go look this up. This is an open standard that was created by W3. This allows you to incorporate multi-factor authentication into your web applications that you're developing so that we can move beyond simple static passwords. This is going to be a huge way to help reduce the number of times we see attackers, when they breach something, being able to access other networks and other systems. So I've been rambling a fair bit, so I'm just going to do a little bit of a wrap-up. We want to assume every network that we're dealing with is a hostile network. Whether or not, whatever you're doing with your application, you want to make sure you're not introducing things like not sanitizing your inputs and sanitizing your outputs. That is a big one. SQL injection is a great example. Cross-site scripting is another one. We want to make sure that we are not leaving open buffers so that people can execute arbitrary code. We need to establish that trust in everything that we do and reduce the threat surface. Why would we make it easier for the attackers? We want to continually validate and always be authorizing everybody on your network, or everything on your network as well, and we want to keep it simple. Does that work? There we go. The asset inventory, as much as I hammer on this one, is the key piece of the puzzle. This is your foundational element. I have worked in so many different companies over the years where this piece was something that people just avoided doing because nobody wants to do it. It's very much like log review. Nobody wants to do log review, but it's essential. Pardon to anybody that works for a logging company. I got yelled at once for that. But this is the type of thing that if we don't know who our users are, we don't know what the applications are, we don't know the assets on our network, how are we going to protect them? Defined repeatable processes are something that you can do of your own. No vendor is going to come in and say, here, let me sell you this defined repeatable processes. And now that I've said that, I'm sure there's somebody out there that'll do that. But this is something that you can do yourselves. This will help in the long run to reduce the rate of incidents. And once you have all this set up, the really interesting thing is when you have these agents running on your system so that you can know the asset, you can know the condition of your system, it'll provide you with this wealth of data so you can see anomalies that are being generated. Because users are always going to do new and exciting things with your application and operate in a way that you never imagined possible. And it's always interesting to see that. I've built a career on doing, well, what happens if you do this? And network zone segmentation. I've said this a few times, bless you. I've said this a few times. This is one of those things where there's no reason that you should be sitting in your office or wherever it happens to be and you have direct access to a mainframe system that has all your financial data, unless you need it for work. This is just one of those things. Why do we provide this as a possibility? So, over time, we've seen from talking about network zone segmentation, talking about the original foundational elements of zero trust, going through time, we have seen how everything has transitioned to the point where now we are calling it zero trust, or better yet, unified access security. And the security folks are growing up. And slowly but surely, that flaming sword of justice that people like to wield is starting to fade away because we as security practitioners are realizing this is not going to do anybody any good by saying our way or the highway. We need to have these open conversations. We want to make sure that we have no need for the holy hand grenade of Antioch because that is just overkill. So before I wrap up entirely, is there anybody in here that is a Kubernetes fan? Okay, we got a couple. All right. So if you are so inclined, at 12:30 in room 11, my colleague Julio is going to be giving his talk, Serverless Stack for Kubernetes, and it's something that you really want to check out because he's a really, really fun speaker. So I would really recommend that. That being said, I would really like to say thank you very much, gracias, and pleasure having time with you today. And if you have any questions.
Hello.
Hello.
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you very kindly.
Well, from a pure developer point of view perspective, how can you be able to, let's say, align or be aware with the security folks and the network administration folks in terms of what can be done in terms of security? I mean, we do our own testing and we try to patch the holes the best we can, but most of times there's not anything to do with our code, but with the security holes that might not be looking at. So how, in your opinion, what could be the best approach to that in order to be on the same page?
Okay, I didn't pay him to say that. Quite literally, what you just did right there, asking those questions. That is your most powerful tool. And this is one of those things that really wasn't around 15 years ago, where people just wouldn't have the conversation. They were too busy in their own silos. And then when everything went wrong, they'd all go to war with each other. And it really did no one any good. So yes, exactly that, asking that question. Granted, your application might be using a deprecated version of PHP. You as a developer, that's not your problem. That's the infrastructure folks that are supposed to be maintaining that. But asking the question, saying, is there anything we need to worry about? Are all the libraries up to date? And this is where a tool like Snyk, what I mentioned earlier, this one we can go through and say, okay, this particular library is out of date, and these are the particular vulnerabilities that are associated with that. So yes, very much that is, being able to have that conversation.
Okay, another question, if I may.
Sure, of course.
Okay, this is more on the phone side. Let's assume we're still on an organization where we still have this flaming sword around.
I assume that's very safe to bet, yeah.
Yeah, let's assume that. How can we try to shield from that, from again a pure developer point of view perspective?
So this is where you need to arm yourself with like-minded folks. So great opportunities like the Codemotion community. I don't know if you have a B-Sides in Madrid. Do you have a B-Sides in Madrid? Anybody know? All right, this is a security conference, which is a community-driven event that if you don't have one, somebody want to start one, I highly recommend it. These are those things where you can speak to like-minded folks of how they were able to negotiate, how they were able to get through the same problems. Because guaranteed, everybody in every organization is having very much similar problem. Granted, the Flaming Sword folks are still around, but thankfully they're dying off as a race. And honestly, that is not an easy discussion to have, but it's all about educating that person and helping them feel like they're part of the solution. So when they can be completely divisive and completely obstructionist, you want to actually try and figure out a way to enable them to make them think it's their idea. As simple as that. It's the same thing with my kids. If I can make them think it's their idea, they're going to go, oh, Daddy, how about we do this? Great idea. Same thing applies.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I do that.
There you go.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Oh, I see a hand back there, I think. Oh, yep. The giant blazing arc light is making it hard to see.
They're far away.
Hi, Dave.
Hello.
Beautiful Canadian accent, first things first.
Thank you. Hopefully it wasn't too thick.
So there's plenty of techniques, and we talk about a lot for securing APIs, both internally and externally. I'm sure if you reviewed ours, we have some more things we should be doing. But what about system-generated traffic? So something I'm thinking about at the moment is, following the event-driven architecture, we have a publish-subscribe model. Mm-hmm. How we secure, or can you recommend any techniques or reading we can look at about how we secure event consumption? And by that, I mean, it could be something that's happened based on time, or some other user activity in a different system is triggering other systems to do things, and how we make sure that request is genuine. It's not, it's not been generated specifically by a user, an action, but it might be happened because it's midnight and this thing happens then.
Right.
And this downstream system is reacting. How do we make sure, from an internal network perspective, that that's a genuine event we should be reacting to?
Well, in that particular case, you want to make sure that all your systems are using something like NTP. Using an atomic clock is a great way to do this, so you have timestamps so you can show that it did happen at this particular time. And you don't have all your logs simply resident on the device, whether it's a server, a router, whatever it happens to be. Have all of those logs then again shipped to a central repository, be it a SIM solution or whatever it happens to be, so you can actually correlate this information looking to see, for anomalous behavior. And there's also tools out there like Tripwire is a great one. Tripwire, where you can look for changes on the system that were not part of your change management process, and this could help feed into your SIM solution and then trigger an event where you can say, okay, this is something we need to look at. I hope that helps. I'm not sure that it does, based on what I think I can see of your face.
Kind of. Maybe I'll come down and talk at the end of it.
And also there is email address there as well. You're more than welcome to drop me an email as well, and check out duo.com for other stuff. But I'm more than happy to talk with you afterwards as well.
Great, thanks.
Cheers. Any other questions?
Oh, okay.
All right. Room 11 for Julio. Thank you very much for having me.